Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Reading Interculture podcast. Today, we're here with Gracie Adelina May, and we're going to be discussing her piece, Those Grabbing Things. And we're looking forward to this one. How are you today, Gracie?
I'm really good. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, I'm feeling good. How are you guys?
We're very well.
I'm really well, at least. I can speak for Zara.
I'm very well.
You look well. So, Gracie, do you want to introduce yourself for the people at home? Who are you? What do you do? What are you doing
Yeah,
here?
what do I do here? Well, I have just come back from Madrid, Spain,
Mhm.
where I was teaching for a year. So I wrote this piece when I was out there in Madrid,
Mhm.
the exhibition for Eduardo Geleda. And I was working with the British Council and kids between the ages of 12 to 18, which was like the best, most difficult experience ever. And before that, I was studying English literature at Bristol. So I was there for 4 years. And at my time there, I was really interested in sort of interdisciplinary studies.
Mhm.
Um, I've never really written much about visual art, but since leaving university, it's been something I keep kind of returning to. And throughout my master's specifically, I was really interested in the idea of textual objects or text as objects, and the kind of material afterlives of, books or pamphlets or kind of just the written word in general, and how it kind of lives out this afterlife, which is sometimes quite different from, or even despite of the author's intentions. Um, so that was kind of what I was thinking about when I was writing this. And there's something called the white text theory or the white space theory, which I was thinking about before kind of writing this, which is basically the amount of sort of white space in regards to the black text which is on the page. So I was very interested in kind of Renaissance pamphlets or these quite ephemeral pieces of literature which were circulating and were kind of intended to be wasted.
Mhm.
And you kind of have the hierarchy of paper. So it goes, the more white or the more white space there is, the more valuable it typically is.
Mm.
Um, and so I was really thinking about that. I think since leaving university, I've been sort of slowly trying to disentangle myself from kind of academic jargon and just academic ways of writing. And I don't think I've done it completely, and I don't think I want to do it completely.
Mm.
But I was thinking a lot about kind of my relationship to the written words and the prioritization of the written words. Um, and yeah, basically going to a lot of galleries and
Yeah.
thinking about my own incommunicability in like a new place. So that's where I was at. And
Mm,
currently I'm just trying to write as much as I can.
Mm.
amazing. Do you usually just write nonfiction, or do you write poetry or fiction or anything like that as well?
Well, I only started writing this year. Obviously, I was writing a lot of essays in university. And when I got to Madrid, I sort of felt a lot. I kind of felt the wall of language and sort of your own distance from the social world around you. So I started writing different, I've mainly written creative nonfiction or sort of essays, I guess you would call them, and poetry as well. But I'm interested in these things as kind of like spontaneous, um, quite lucid forms of perception, more so than kind of premeditated ideas. And yeah, I've not written a huge amount so far. I've been writing a few different poems or essays which have been published by a few different places, but it's all very new to me, and I'm very interested to see kind of where it still goes. I'm still very much finding my voice and the ways I want to write about the world, I think.
Mm. I think this. I found this really interesting that you said that you want to kind of distance yourself from the academic jargon, and I don't know. It's kind of usually education is seen as kind of the building blocks of something, and you want to build on top of them. But I very much resonate with the idea that sometimes you've built something and you're actually not quite sure if it's a good thing, and you want to kind of unbuild these blocks again. I've kind of had this experience as well after finishing uni. We both of us also studied English literature, um, so that really resonates with me, and I feel like probably we could start a discussion about the piece. But before we do that, would you like to read it out?
Yes, let me get it up. Okay. So, those grabbing things. I'm trying to deprioritize the written word. I'm trying to place less importance on the words that accompany art, because surely the art at hand is capable of formulating a conversation of its own with me, in its own terms. The Eduardo Geleda exhibition has, first and foremost, a wall of text bigger and wider than me. I'm always embarrassed living in Madrid to veer towards the inevitable English translation in galleries as I do now, but to read the Spanish would take me painstakingly long, and the exhibition closes in an hour. The textual overview is competent, sufficiently encompassing and accurate. I'm still growing exasperated with synopses, and even the essayistic academic tendency of tying up loose ends. In the Prado Museum, the text that accompanies art is sometimes much more far-reaching and poetic than what is necessarily warranted, but I cannot blame this either. I write now into this tradition of transference, of seeing art and feeling bizarrely, egoistically certain that I can and must use it to create something else. In the hope of never being selfish, to compensate for my consumption and consumption and consumption, I can slip into the space of the artist as left by the artist. Call this in dialogue with. Dialogue is like a metaphor, with vehicle, tenor, primary and secondary forces. Who gives anyone the right to the posterior? Is the afterthought worthwhile on its own? And is the accompanying text doomed to be a metatextual contemplation on the means and ends of artistic production? I may as well have lunch. The house of forgetfulness, body of air, how profound the wind is, project for monument to tolerance, in praise of the horizon, meeting place, at the limit. Hard not to feel as though the naming of these sculptures must be the zenith point. But is the naming always a secondary act? An artist I strongly admire says sometimes words and phrases come to her through the artistic process, and she finds a way to figure out what the words mean. In this way, the action-reaction of art is reversed, and the written seems to have a more powerful influence over the senses than what I usually consider allowed. I suppose this resistance to the written word stems from a university literary education, where deconstructive and decolonial theories are foregrounded as radical ways of reconceptualizing received knowledge. Throw off the shackles of Descartes and foreground the body. Realize and remember the language sign problem. Derrida will say the word is always absent. Wittgenstein, towards the end of his life, said the inner is a delusion. Interiority is best represented and made known to us through writing. We associate the act of writing as this transference between immaterial and material. Copyright law and intellectual property seem unimaginable without this priming of the written word. And then, the end of language, the wall that marks the end. Body of air is surely the very Cartesian dream of this overcoming. The exhibition includes over 100 pieces of Chileda's work, including sketches which are, we are told, to be treated as artifacts in their own right. I wish we could always play the minor keys on this level ground. We are guilty of forming relationships with everything else, finding patterns, and in these patterns a temporal stretch, pinpointing the rise of fame, eventual assimilations into the cultural elite, and the ultimate meaningless sign maker, taste. I am personally going through waves of illusionment and disillusionment in my personal life, wondering if every person is doomed to figure out the same problems, artistically or not, and find the same answerlessness found in wind tunnels or echo chambers. Would a rose by any other name smell as sweet? The sketches are strikes out of a dark space onto a light one, flashes of ink on paper that seem hieroglyphic at times and chemical at others. They seem a priori and axiomatic as much as they do remote. The skeletal arrangement of lines on certain sketches reminds me of chemical compounds, bonds and double bonds between discrete atoms, and the changing of the part in response to the whole. Brian Dillon, in his essays on affinity, notes the kind of violence of this transformation, the things usurping other things. Halfway in between alphabets and numbers, one sketch in particular looks not dissimilar to the katakana alphabet, or like small angular bodies crawling, jumping, and falling to a summit we cannot see. The fact I can see bodies in all of the most insignificant of lines might not be down to artistic expression, but also to the viewer's hopeless tendency to personify, and in this personification to attribute empathy. I should not pity the lines, I think, to no one. Other pieces lose their geometric certainty and instead seem to show accumulation and coagulation of liquids or gas. There is a wall dedicated to Chaleda's drawings of hands, which embody this smoky, bulbous form more akin to his earlier sculpture. I stare at the hands for a long time because in them I can see everything. They recur throughout his work, and once I see them, everything immediately makes sense to me. He loved his own hands. If he did not, he at least kept returning to them as some kind of motif and emblem to be demonstrated through his other works. When I was first experimenting with art, I would draw my hands over and over again. They are a limitless supply of life and the ultimate symbol of creation. In literature, a lot is to be said for the image of the writing hand. It can be disembodied, standing in for the thinking mind, materializing the action of cogito ergo sum. The hands, the palms with their folds and many creases, are the point at which both lightness and dark are expressed. Emptiness and fullness are present, for example, when we peer into the gentle form of the cupped hand holding nothing but its own shadow. To quote Descartes more fully, we might say dubito ergo cogito ergo sum. I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. Artistic creation, the fingers that appear intertwined, reaching, those grabbing things, they body forth the spirit of the maker, medium, and message. He speaks to us through a question printed on the wall near the end of the exhibition. Thanks to space, there are limits to the physical universe, and I can be a sculptor. Are there also limits for the spirit? Philosophers like Wittgenstein look to the language wall or gate and acknowledge the human totality of dissonance and inexpressibility. The tools we have allow us to create, but does this mean the soul is the message, inscribed through materials secondary and supplemented, manifesting finally as words on a tapioca-coloured wall? How profound the wind is. I do not approach exhibitions the right way. I have started this one backwards, half accidentally but not unwittingly. I encounter the hands about a quarter way through, and I'm unsure if they are meant to synecdotally encompass everything I see, or suggest some gradual accumulation of artistic energy. I circle around myself, turning from sketch to sculpture and back again, in an almost haphazard manner. To me, this feels intuitive and correct. I pay close attention to what is titled and what isn't. Notice the discrepancies in the stories suggested by the form and that are disclosed by the names attributed. Then, on second thought, how they are not dissonant but complementary. The undoubtable openness of many of his sculptures, including ones such as Looking for Light and Project for Monument to Tolerance. How some seem to really truly demand an erasure of individuality and the complete surrender to something hopeless and universal as the future, in praise of the horizon. I grew tired of deconstruction, the impossible arbitrariness of it all. Linguistically speaking, it is not true that words are random associations of letters with no material grounding. But there are problems in this interplay with the material and immaterial, with our constant and successive downplay of the latter in praise of the former. In part, my reactions against this in my MA, I studied extensively the object world of texts, the importance of texts as objects, of texts being bound by the limits of their world, and by the complete vulnerability of their spatial relationships. Look at marginalia, bookbinding, reused paper. I see a picture of Chaleda in his studio, working surrounded by a million pieces of scrap paper. In the accompanying video to the exhibition, we see a Weldon studio where iron is smoldered and melted and forced into shape. Ben Lerner calls the poem The Cut because it is the splicing of dead matter, the crisp and discerning mechanical movement we make through gesture and art to change the present form. I can see now that sculpting does the same in praxis and theory. The cut is indistinguishable from the cutting tools. The smoke, fire and dust emanating from the scene seems a caricature of labour and labouring conditions. It feels hot, dense and heavy in a way I always know sculpture can be. Recently, Apple has been releasing commercials in two forms, the advert and the maker's process, which accounts for the second advert. The indispensable part of art is the artist's process, the making hand and the pieces of debris that remain. Is the hand enough? scrunched, offering, prodding, ink stained, limited, taking, giving.
Amazing. Thank you for
Thanks so
reading
much.
Thank you.
Very, very well read.
Yes, I agree. It's such a rich essay and there's so much there. And I really want to resist the urge that I feel right now to start at the end.
Yeah.
But so
Like you with the exhibition.
exactly.
Yes, exactly.
So where this essay kind of starts is the written word in an art gallery, and I know exactly what you mean, the signs that kind of explain to you what you should feel, what you should see, what is there, and I do often wonder what if this wasn't here and it was just the painting. What I think is as kind of profound, and then also this essay kind of also asks the question, what kind of well, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about this later. I think I was kind of reminded of Against Interpretation by Susan Sontag while reading this, and I got a quote from it out to read to you, which is, by reducing the work of art to its content and then interpreting that, one tames the work of art. Interpretation makes art manageable, comfortable. And it seems like the speaker in this essay is kind of aware of this fact and is trying to resist it. And there is a kind of an attempt to resist interpretation and move towards an authentic kind of engagement with art. But it's as you said, you used the word lucid earlier. It is a very lucid essay, and it's kind of talking about the failure of that attempt. So I wanted to ask about this because it's such a multivocal essay, but it seems to me like it starts there, that with an awareness that you shouldn't need the words to kind of explain, and you shouldn't rely on this interpretation, but it's still it's very, very difficult. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So you're completely right. And I think the idea of artistic interpretation is very much akin to artistic translation, in that it becomes its own sort of medium and it becomes a way of explaining away a lot of discrepancies or a lot of kinks in art. It was specifically why I was sort of drawn to sculpture in general, because in sculpture, what you deal with is a kind of manner of reading very different from what we expect from literary texts. In that a lot of sculptors I admire, Chileda and others included, sort of talk about the immediacy of perception and this idea of perception over experience. And I think of when we think of the kind of the moral benefits of reading, which is often sort of a prolonged contemplation and the ability and this kind of hierarchy of retrospection. And sometimes when dealing with sculpture, when looking at sculpture, you sort of just have the vastness of the present moment as opposed to kind of the future or the past. It's one of the ways I think writing and sculpture are kind of almost antagonizing each other, but very complementary as well. Chileda specifically speaks about kind of art as being between two giants, between sort of like past and future. So I think going into reading and experiencing visual art, it's interesting to sort of treat it as an exercise in anti-interpretation. I don't think it's something which I can do very readily. And I think in the essay, that's why I talk about the sort of, that's why I end up bringing in, I think, these sort of, or peppering in sort of names of academics and critics and other books I've read, and this idea of taste. Because I think interpretation is sort of proof of taste. And I think even through the act of writing, I'm trying to sort of prove something. And so I think it is a pretty self-critical essay. It's a pretty meta-textual essay. But interpretation as general is sort of translation, and with that is the bias and this impasse towards the end point, which is interesting. I know you said you wanted to start at the end of the essay, and I'm also very guilty of always wanting to make the end the sum of parts of the whole. And I think that's not something which this exhibition, and I think it's not something which artistic practice in general can always summit.
I think that's very interesting. I suppose that's kind of one of the fundamental differences between visual arts and kind of literary art, for lack of a better term, is the
Mm.
so you read out the essay. I've got the essay printed in front of me. We've got it in a magazine. We've got it on our website, and all of these things are the same. They are all the essay in some kind of abstract sense, even though they're different textual objects. They remain the same work of art, at least within the kind of classic conception. And that's the case of my copy of Wordsworth is the same as your copy, even if they're bound differently. There's slightly different editorial decisions. They're both kind of copies of some kind of abstract text within the classic conception, which can certainly be challenged. Whereas visual art, and I think even especially sculpture, there is only one example of it. And even if you were to make a perfect one-to-one copy of a sculpture, nobody would see that as the sculpture. They would see it as a copy of the sculpture. So there's this kind of a text is necessarily an abstraction that is represented by something physical, whereas visual art kind of is the physical thing. It's not. It doesn't have that same level of abstraction. And I think that kind of leads to, as you say, a very different. It leads to like literature and reading being a much more abstractable experience. And I think what you're saying about visual art being kind of immediate and about perception and uninterpretable is very true, because it doesn't have that layer of abstraction. Like the Mona Lisa, it only exists once. You can recreate it as much as you want, but it just is that, and there is no, it's that object specifically, and so that just makes it like less interpretable somehow. I don't know how you would respond to that thought.
Yeah, I really like that idea. And I do think you're right. I think writing is always a certain level of abstraction. And I think specifically when looking at some forms of sculpture, like Chileda's very interested in iron. And he's got a amazing piece in San Sebastian, kind of at the very end point of the city, where it just borders the Atlantic Sea. And it's called Wind Comb, or Comb of the Wind, depending on the translation. And what you kind of see is these kind of finger-like structures sort of being oxidized and therefore constantly changing. I think it's beautiful to see that play out in real time in a manner akin to something more like pre-standardized English language. I think the idea of writing as a standardized practice, writing as a sort of institution, is something which was really interesting to me throughout academia. It's something I spent a lot of time studying. And what you see in certain periods of literature is a space where there's a lot more malleability and there's a lot less direct sort of, a lot less translatability. And it's something which I think the written word is always circling around. So that's why in the essay I'm talking a lot about deconstructive theory, this idea that, like you're saying, with abstraction, the kind of ultimate essence is always abstract. And within this, the kind of prioritization of the mind over the body, where we're kind of always searching for the immaterial kind of soul, this immaterial essence, which we are doomed to circle around and never be able to probe into. Descartes is someone I'm really interested in and have a very ambivalent relationship to, because I think throughout university I was sort of trained to sort of despise this way of thinking, to despise the hierarchy of the material and immaterial. And this is slightly tangential, but I think it's what I always love talking about is considering the mind-body problem and how it's quite literally the bedrock of a lot of Western philosophy and a lot of our treatment of literature and art, is sort of to remind everyone like Descartes was this deeply skeptical, kind of tormented figure who was essentially having like a series of bad dreams when he comes to this mind-body problem. And I think it's so funny to realize the sort of foundation of Western philosophical thought is sort of dependent on this guy with bad dreams. And to see, what we actually make of that when the foundations of so much are quite faulty in and of themselves. I think that's veering a little bit away from what you were talking about, but I love to talk about that.
No, I really don't think it is. It is deviating away. Like I think I don't know if like you can map it all onto each other with these kind of binaries, of the visual art and
Mm,
textual art and interpretability and non-interpretability and body and mind. These things they'll kind of exist. They can be mapped onto each other quite easily within a kind of binary system. So I don't think that is going away. I think that makes a lot of sense.
mm,
Like you could maybe be like maybe visual art is the
mm.
body and textual art is the mind. Maybe there's something there. I don't know if that applies.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. No, I really like that. I'm also, yeah, I'm thinking specifically because you mentioned sort of your own distrust of, not distrust, but I think there's a very healthy skepticism to sort of academic trajectories and um, this distrust of the written words, I think, which is quite a healthy thing to start thinking through. You would call it, I guess, like logocentrism, as it was taught to me kind of academically. And it's the idea that the text is sort of the dead, finished final object, much like standardized language. Um, and I think it's what Wittgenstein talks about when he kind of sees the wall of language, is this final form which sort of attempts to defy interpretation. And I think there's so much kind of beauty before this point, or there's so much flexibility before this point. And some, I think through treating, sculpture and things like books as material, decaying objects, you can see how the kind of word and the text itself, or the letter and the physical constraints of the letter, such as the paper or the materials used, are kind of in this often uneven relationship. So specifically when I was studying like pamphlets, they kind of live out these kind of wayward miscellaneous afterlives where they sort of crop up in, maybe they're used for wrapping, or maybe they're literal like toilet paper, or reused, written over again. And obviously now we kind of treat essays in and of themselves as these quite neat compartmentalized forms. And I'm always thinking about this progression towards neatness and this progression towards the sort of final object, which is in itself a kind of death. And I think Chileda specifically is quite interested in this. So I know in a lot of his pieces, he titles them with Roman numerals after their titles. So they'll be called like topos, with the Roman numeral for three after. And apparently it's because when he was creating, he was asking himself the same question. So the numeral corresponds to the amount of times he asked himself a specific question. And just the idea of, artistic practice is the immediacy of perception. And I think the grace to ask yourself the same question over and over again, which would be defined by a lot of people as kind of madness. But I think in literature, we allow for the space, and we allow for the kind of repetitions and discrepancies in what we find when we bring ourselves to objects or sculpture or texts.
Hmm. Yeah, I was actually gonna talk about this. This seems vaguely related to me too. The kind of the I should not pity the lions bit in the essay,
Mm,
and there is a kind of a presence of the viewer, of the reader, if you will, and oh yeah, you say. The fact I can see bodies in all of the most insignificant of lines might not be down to artistic expression, but also to the viewer's hopeless tendency to personify. So there's kind of the idea that the which is also, I think, a very common idea in the kind of literary education process, that the writer, the author is dead, the piece of art exists, but what the kind of engagement with the reader does. Like it's the writing and the creation of art is only kind of half of the piece. It's the engagement with the viewer or with the reader that kind of makes it what it is. And I don't know, considering especially that this is also a way we are taught to view things in literary education. And I think this essay kind of explores the way that there's almost like a feeling of guilt, maybe, with engaging with art in different ways that you're kind of told to do. Read the sign, but also don't read the sign and deprioritize words and think about the viewer and not just the artist, and these sort of things. You almost can't do it right, and obviously everybody, all academics disagree with each other, and you kind of have to think about also what actually feels right. Like deconstruction is all nice and great, but in our everyday lives, is that really something that we is that really a way that we really view everything all the time? Is that even possible? Is that even something we want to do? I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about all that, if that resonates with you, if that makes sense to you.
No, I know. It is difficult because there's so many these like big questions which obviously academics and writers have spent centuries failing to answer. I think the essay that we're talking about doesn't, I wouldn't say I claim to or even really try to answer a lot of the things I set out to say either. But you're right, because especially now when we see a lot of, I suppose, art being used in such a violently taste-making way. In that it's sort of becoming more and more important to be seen to be sort of cultured and well-read. And every time I go to galleries, I feel the like weight of performative, performance really in the gallery space. We can talk a little bit about like if performance is even inherently a bad thing. But there's a lot of competing there's a lot of competing demands made on viewers and on readers. And I think I've started asking my friends that like to go to galleries what they think about when they go to galleries, because it started to bother me the fact that when I went to an exhibition, I was only really capable of bringing my own experience or my own perception to it. In that even if art was really moving me and making me reflect, it was typically making me nostalgic or making me remember things. And sometimes it's very difficult to train the eye to sort of treat objects as they are, to form conversations with them in the present moment. And I think there's this problem of the individual in writing. I think it's the problem which sort of deconstruction circles around, and ultimately, it's not really used that much anymore, deconstructive theory. It sort of had its heyday in like I suppose the 80s or the 90s. And it's since been pretty heavily critiqued. And I wish I knew that before sort of studying in university, because I was sort of so invested in it for like 3 years before finally sort of writing my dissertation. And I also felt the like deep sort of insubstantiality, or the deep emptiness which comes from sort of obsessing over arbitrariness and being convinced that there is an absence at the center. And I think the individual, or bringing individuality to texts, is never really, it's kind of the immovable force, or the unstoppable force and the immovable object. It's sort of, you can't write yourself, or you can't read yourself out of the things that you interact with. So it's why I have quite a tricky relationship with people like Descartes or the deconstructive movement. And yeah, I think pitying the lines, the idea of hopeless personification, the idea of, I think, empathy, and the idea of literature specifically as a tool which humanity has to, I suppose literature as a tool which humanity kind of owes itself, is quite a tricky, it's a tricky problem that we have. I think that it's very tempting to say we do not need to impose morality onto texts, we should treat them as aesthetic objects. But especially now, I think there's no surefire way of knowing kind of what we would be without it, or the duty that we have to other people, if that kind of Makes sense.
Yeah, I do. I agree with that. I think that's the distinction that people make between like a moral and an aesthetic an artist is often false. I think like the immoral is ugly and the moral is beautiful. I think like
I don't know.
morality is aesthetics. You know, there's an aesthetic aspect to if I read a book that I think is morally horrible, my aesthetic experience of that book is harmed. You know, there's certainly a relationship between those two things. Um,
We've had very long,
Yeah.
extensive arguments about the Keats line, and beauty is truth and truth beauty. And I think that's not true. And Chris thinks it is true. So
Okay.
this kind of brings to me
so
this
yeah, it's
similar
kind of
similar thing.
you don't think there's something ugly about fascism. You don't think there's something about yeah about there's something just like something
But there's
aesthetically
also
displeasant about it.
I'm not talking about fascism. I'm talking about, I don't know, Madame Bovary or these sort of things that are, or like uh I don't know, books where there's immorality, and it's aesthetic, it's
Yeah,
interesting,
but
it's
I don't mean that it depicts immorality. I mean that the morality of the text as a whole. But yes.
No, I love this debate. I love this debate, and I think I change sides so frequently. But I suppose it's more of asking where you think the surface of anything begins or ends. I think a lot of reading practices sort of encourage the idea of surface or superficiality, not as in a pejorative way of saying superficial, as in literal surface versus depth. And I think a lot of it comes down to whether you think um, it's whether you sort of read things on like a vertical or a horizontal plane, I think. So that's not answering that's not answering anything. But I love this question, and I think Chileda also. I was watching an interview with him before this, and he was very firmly of the belief that beauty was in front of art. And I think what he means is essentially, if beauty comes about, that in itself is sort of irrespective of the artistic practice. Beauty might be something which we retrospectively attribute to things, but it's not an innate essence in and of itself. And he was sort of, I don't think he believes beauty cloaked or concealed any art, but I think he was of the impression that the laborious, perhaps kind of tactile ugliness, specifically of iron and things, like the kind of smoldering that I'm talking about, is so dense and so heavy and so kind of brutal in a way, um, that you kind of stop thinking in terms of ugliness or beauty, full stop. You kind of feel the movement and I suppose, just like the human hands behind things. Um, so I think that's sort of talking to what you're talking about now. I love this idea of beauty being in front of things, like a veneer, which does not make it good or bad, but it makes it sort of an additional layer, definitely.
interesting.
What's then behind beauty?
The hands, I guess, and I suppose, you know, art as, and I don't want to, keep like getting too theoretical with it. I suppose art as production has been, again, another really, an unavoidable and sort of inexpressible form of creation. I think also, not to circle around or not to bring in the elephant in the room, but obviously I'm writing very much with the idea that the human hand is somehow becoming more valuable. And I mean, in the sense that as we grow more skeptical as to if words we're reading and if art we're seeing is like human made, or if it is using artificial intelligence or somehow kind of insulting or betraying our senses, there is an increasing amount of value placed on the literal, the writing hand, the creating, the creator. And this is ambivalent again. I think it raises more issues to do with class and more issues to do with, it's more signifiers of sort of taste. But it's something which I've become very obsessed with. I think I remember like I've been claiming that like Enlightenment values are gonna come back in this year because of our distrust of like AI. So I think there's this real, I'm sure you guys have noticed like this impulse towards sincerity and authenticity as kind of these new sort of calibers which people and artists should be reaching and should be striving for. Especially sincerity is this kind of like sort of this belief system in and of itself. Um, so I'll be interesting to see. I don't know if you guys have
No,
thought about this or if you've noticed this as well.
no, that's very interesting. And that's very true with about sincerity. That's very, very much the trend, especially in popular music. But like it assumes, to come back to deconstruction, it assumes a self to which one can be sincere to. Uh, so it kind of is, as you said, like a kind of pre or post deconstructionist thought that that you can be sincere, that art should be sincere, because you need a self then, don't you, to be sincere to. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I don't know if there's a self that you can whittle away towards. And I think I don't know if this makes sort of the essay I was writing slightly hypocritical because there's this skepticism of like I'm a little bit skeptical of like the supreme image of like the writing hand or this idea of the creator or the true self that
Mm,
can be kind of revealed through art. Um, Again, I mean, to return to Chile, there, it's sort of the immediacy of perception and the immediacy of the present in that all that will be and all that kind of is contained in the art should be constantly visible. So he kind of uses the idea of the center or of volume and space to suggest that everything that it should always be visible. If the center, not saying they're always hollow, but he's saying you can either see through the middle or you see the material that is the middle, which I think is a
mm,
really beautiful idea, speaking to this idea of art and beauty and the planes through which we analyze things. There is this unifying dream that, of sort of, I suppose, yeah, like a uniform idea of wholeness, really, which a lot of art gestures towards, while being aware that this
mm,
is something which we can't really complete, I think.
very interesting.
I have a question about this kind of um, the kind of creation of this essay, or not just the creation of this essay, but this essay's existence. So you kind of say, you say
Mm.
he loved his own hands. If he did not, he at least kept returning to them as some kind of motif and emblem to be demonstrated through his other works. And I find this a really, really interesting sentence, because you kind of you create a narrative. He loved his own hands, like
Mm.
maybe they would do on a sign, and then you immediately doubt your own narrative, and seem kind of unsettled with creating a narrative at all. And but there's still kind of an attempt at it. It's like with the signs, there is definitely a sense that there's something wrong with the
Mm.
act of standing next to a painting or a sculpture and just reading the sign and having it inform this interpretation. There's certainly some unsettledness there, but the speaker can't kind of help
Mm.
themselves, and they kind of it's still there. And you could also say that you wrote this whole essay as well about this kind of, and it's not a very you're not saying this is correct, it's not an argumentative essay, but it's still a piece of writing, and it's still
Mm.
it's kind of, to a certain extent, also doing the work that the signs do, and that is kind of being questioned.
Mm.
um, how do you kind of feel about that?
Yeah, I'm really happy you asked that. I think because in and of itself, I was sort of going into the essay with the awareness. I think I'm going to try and find the line, but there's a point when I say, um, it's when I'm discussing sort of the consumption and consumption of art and how
Yes.
there's this slightly strange notion we have to see art and immediately feel this sort of bizarre um, power or need to recreate it into something which we can sort of own and possess. And that is literally what I did in writing on this exhibition. I don't think it's a neutral activity, but I don't think it's immoral or it's necessarily wrong. But it's kind of Frankensteinian in this amalgamation and repurposing of parts. Um, so I think it does speak to what the sign does, and I think I'm interested in sort of what we owe to art in general, in that when we project narratives or when we project assumptions and linearity onto, non-linear and quite atemporal things, we sort of owe other people our projections. We owe art our projection onto it, which is quite a strange headspace to inhabit. But I think it speaks to, again, this cycling and this cyclicality and this returning to, texts or to objects like we're doing now, and that there's like a constant change and there's a constant impulse towards returning, which I think is why deconstruction is why I still see it so often. It's like the main sort of, I don't know if it's right to call it trendy, but I see it all the time through like social media in quite like strange bite-sized ways. It's obviously resonating with people a lot, and I think it is literally this kind of this obsession with the return and, yeah, the projections or refractions which come from these sort of circles in and out of this. This is this is a very abstract conversation, but I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, I actually did want to ask you about as well this section. I think it's the third paragraph where you talk about consumption, 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 and it's kind of, I mean, it ties back very nicely to the very end of the essay with the Apple products, but it's this it's very critical of kind of consumption of art, and I was wondering what you think.
Mm.
Is there a difference between consumption of art, or let's say overconsumption of art, or this kind of art that doesn't necessarily feel like the interaction with art that doesn't feel pure? Is there a difference of consumption of art in that way and other things? And is it bad to consume art? And it reminded me of this kind of TikTok thing, like name one hobby of yours that's not media consumption. And I find that a little bit cynical because it's I guess there is a difference between scrolling or these sort of things and going to a gallery. But what is that difference? Is there a difference? Is it actually the same? What's your stance on
Mm.
that?
Yeah, it's like the bane of my life currently, these kind of questions, because they're so important, and I think there there's no right way of consuming anything, really. I mean, obviously people love to say there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. We've all sort of heard that, and there is an element of truth in that. I think at one point, like I was saying earlier, I sort of believed that the antidote to consumption could be production. But this is also sort of, I would say it's not getting off the hamster wheel in any sense. And there's also, I'm sure you guys are kind of familiar with the sort of pejorative or slightly, I don't know, slightly insulting discourse at the moment of sort of saying like everyone's a writer. Everyone's a writer now. Everyone has Substack. Everyone writes think pieces. Everyone's writing, essays. And I think it's much more interesting to think not really of this as a sort of means of becoming or assuming an identity position, but at least for a lot of people that write and for a lot of people that consume media, um, it's sort of more of an unavoidability. And I think it's like Helen Gardner. I've been reading her essays or her diaries actually, and she sort of talks about art as trying to make the bed while inside of it, or to write as trying to make the bed while inside of it, and also the idea of sort of, if not writing, then what? If, to not write is sort of to die, at least in her view. And this is obviously a very extreme viewpoint of artistic production, but I think nonetheless there's this, poetry is like a song. Sometimes it kind of is what it is, and you kind of have to meet it on its own terms. Same like sculpture. So that's sort of the it's not really an answer, but I think you can sort of tie yourself into these hermeneutic circles where all production is consumption, and all art is essentially futile, if you like. It's sort of how you spin the coin.
Yeah, it's quite a difficult. It's not an essay that necessarily invites you to a kind of clear answer, which is also its strength, I think. I think I would still like to talk about the ending, and there is kind of so much there. First of all, you say the cut is indistinguishable from the cutting tools, which I think is very interesting, and I would like to hear about that. And then there's this, as I mentioned earlier, this the Apple product that you say recently Apple has been releasing commercials in two forms: the advert and the maker's process, which accounts for a second advert. So there is the ad, and then there's the creation process, and is the kind of presentation of the artist's process also art, or is it I don't know, what is the connection there for you between the Apple product and the piece of art?
The Apple advert, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's so, in a way, it's frustrating to see tech companies sort of articulate exactly what it is that we all know, and like that a lot of artists know, which is that, again, these hands, or the kind of the human behind the finished product is a big part of the value of the finished product. And again, obviously, to do with things like AI, this is only going to gain more currency. And I think it really literalizes the Apple adverts I'm talking about really literalize this, the cut and the cutting tools. And I think, speaking again to sort of beauty and aesthetic surfaces, is that, much like a lot of artists now, I think people consume media with this intent to see exactly how it is that people reach their teleological endpoint. I wish I had something more like hopeful to say about this. I don't think it's a negative thing in and of itself. But I think once again, we're seeing kind of human labor be devalued and valued in a really interesting way. I don't know what will happen in the future, but I know it's, when you see things as well, I think there's been a lot of, discussion on sort of tech firms, or sort of, like Mark Zuckerberg suddenly, trying to sort of embody style, trying to buy kind of these spaces, trying to buy these meeting points, where we're on the outside looking in, but we can also, understand that they are sort of articulating what the human desire, which is to be sort of, to be the creator. I wish I had something slightly more hopeful to say, but but it is true. It is true. And I think, sorry to kind of finish, I think there's, again, to return to sort of like the essence, or something indescribable, or something which cannot be either like the cut or the cutting tools. Shaleda kind of had this idea of the black light of, he says the black light of sort of the Atlantic or just his home place, which was like the Basque country. And he kind of puts it in dialogue with the white light of Mediterranean sort of sculpture. And once again, the kind of like text or the sort of the magnetic pull of the white space around textual objects, or, you know, this kind of consumable, aesthetically sort of perhaps beautiful or quite moral space is sort of underwritten by the process by which you get there, or this, I don't know, this black light, this slightly strange, untranslatable kind of impulse, which is to create, but perhaps to create things which, you know, don't clearly fit into the consumable artifactual spaces. Um, I love that he, I love that he kind of returns to this throughout his work, and it's made me think a lot about what it is we want from creation in general. So I wanted to bring that in.
Yeah, that probably perfectly brings us to the kind of final question that we ask everyone, um, which is, why do you think people should write? Or should they?
Yeah, because I think that's quite interesting with this a piece about the limits of writing and why it should be maybe deprioritized is a particularly I was particularly excited to ask this question to you. So no pressure.
I hope I can answer it well. I think so. Like I said, there is this slightly insulting notion that everyone is a writer, and especially in adjacent with that, that like no one reads, which I don't think is true. And I think it's very true. A lot of hobbies are becoming slightly sought after. But I think writing in and of itself is the only time you kind of get to stop spinning, or the only time you get to truly exist between sort of past and future. And I think of it a lot like possession, and I think of it a lot in relation to this sort of black light, in that if the seeds are ever there, and if the seeds are ever kind of germinating, or if you're ever sort of doomed to make these repetitions into like memories or into sculpture or into any sort of art, then I think the only way to disentangle yourself from that is to sort of, you know, commit the word to the page in and of itself. I don't think writing is ever like a finished thing. So I think it's sort of an exercise that we get in, I just suppose, like practicing being, and yeah, stopping spinning, which I like. And I hope everyone gets to do it sometimes. I don't think everyone needs to publish, and I think publishing is a different thing. But writing is like song. It's different from everything else.
That's very interesting. It's kind of there's a kind of I think of it as like a supply and demand. There's maybe a supply and demand issue with writing and literature
Mm.
in some ways. There's more people write than the demand there is for reading. I think, for example, I think a lot more people want to be published in a magazine like we run than would be interested in
Mm.
reading a magazine like we run. There's a kind of a supply and demand issue, perhaps, if that
Mm.
makes sense. Um, and that's not a problem, you know. There's no reason why people should want to read a magazine, you know. It's fine. But like the point is that
Mm.
there's a kind of a strange impulse to want to be published somewhere that you probably wouldn't read, and it's strange to receive more submissions than we do even visitors to the website. Is kind of there's something peculiar about that, perhaps. I don't know what that speaks to,
Yeah.
but there is, you know, I don't know how do you respond to that idea?
Yeah, because I do think it is a problem, and I would say problem like, you know, pretty like heavy-handedly. Um, it's funny because I think publishing or writing has never really historically been respected. Um, but once
Mm.
again, it's entering the sort of third space of more ambiguous, sort of just like taste in general, where it becomes, yeah, like a sign or a marker of something, of some kind of cultural worth. So I think of, I read for like other publications, and it's, you can tell when people write and they don't read. And I don't know if this is a kind of last minute attempt at identity formation, or if it's the overwhelming feeling that everyone should be good at everything and that there should be many strings to your bow and a kind of like jack of all trades situation. I think a lot about sort of, what's expected from celebrities and what is expected from entry level jobs, and how there's this kind of crushing amalgamation of parts. Like the machine is on its last legs. And it's I don't know what to recommend for that. I hope there's still people doing the kind of heavy lifting of reading and often writing for no one. I think writing for no one is like one of the most important things that we can do, and I think that's what we owe to people as well. That's my hot take, but I don't know.
Well, that's good. I agree. I think on that note, on the crushing amalgamation of all things, it's a perfect time to end the podcast.
Yeah.
No, it's been really fun. It's been a great chat, I think. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. I know people got a lot to do, so it's very kind that people, give us the time to do this kind of thing. After already giving us so much of their work and time for free already, so it's pretty cool. Thanks so much.
No, it's been a very, very lovely chat. You've had very, very interesting thoughts, and I take a lot away with me. So thank you so much for doing this with us.
And thank you for talking. Yeah, thank you. Your questions have been great as well.
Thanks.
I hope everyone continues to read Reading into Culture. I hope this is a lifelong passion of yours. I hope you get to always have these conversations and come to these meeting points. Thank you guys so much.
Pleasure's all ours. And with that, I guess we'll say thanks so much for watching or listening. It's been a real fun podcast. Sorry, I look at the camera. It's been a real fun podcast. There you are, there, not there. Thanks so much for being here, Gracie. Thanks for having such a wonderful piece. Thanks for being so cool and interesting and fun. And there'll be another episode next Sunday. And you should go to readingintoculture.com and read all of the issues, read all of them, every single piece, and all the author bios, and just sit there and just refresh the page a bunch. Also, what you should do is buy the magazine. It's pretty cool. You should buy it. We have a physical copy now, and you should buy it. And also tell your aunt. And then next week you can tell your uncle, and so on. And then you'll tell everybody you know. But just this week, that's your project. That's your homework for next Sunday. And we'll see you then, bright and early. Bye, guys.
Bye,
Gracie.